Hello, this is Mr. Hammond-Beyer again, and this is the first APES lecture, basically an overview of the course, Chapter 1, Environmental Problems, Their Causes, and Sustainability. So the things that we touch on in this lecture we will go into in more depth as we go through the course. Okay, there is a video I would like you to look at, this YouTube video. Watch it if you pick this up either in Canvas, or from the lecture, type this in or copy and paste this in and take a look at this lecture on YouTube. There's an article from Garrett Hardin that is up in Canvas. There's a rewritten version which is also up there. I'd like you to read the rewritten version, take a few minutes and read through that. At some point it'll come back and we'll have more discussions on it very promptly. Okay. Some discussion questions as we start on this endeavor. What is the root of all commons problems? As you look at the commons and how it works. What other issues compound problems associated with the commons? And what was your response as a group yesterday? You've now had a commons exercise to the discoveries of the problems associated with the commons. And what did you do to solve them? And finally, explain the logic of the commons. What was Hardin's thinking on this? What was your thinking when you were addressing this commons problem? And once you came to a solution, assuming that you and your group did, we're going to call that enlightenment. How do we create enlightenment within the entire human population? Considering education levels, socioeconomics, personal and familial needs, etc. Okay, for Chapter 1, here are a couple of overview questions for this chapter. What are the main themes of the book? What keeps us alive? What is an environmentally sustainable society? How do we get to that point in space and time? What impact or how fast is the human population growing? The numbers I present are going to be a little dated because COVID has changed things a little bit with 180 or 190,000 deaths just in America. You know, that's going to change the slope of that curve a little bit. And what do we have? What's the difference between economic growth, economic development, and an environmentally sustainable economic development? All right, and a couple more questions. What are the harmful environmental effects of poverty and affluence? So, how has our affluence affected or impacted the environment? What are the three major human cultural changes that have taken place since humans arrived on this planet and started to become a feature in the biosphere? What are the 4 scientific principles of sustainability? How can we use them? Okay, so let's look at the human population growth. So here's the Earth, and if we go back 2 million years ago, the human population was much less than 1 billion people, more closer to 1 to 2 million, and it stayed very, very, very low, way below 1 billion. It started to increase a little bit in at the end of the Dark Ages. And then along came the bubonic plague, which smacked the human population back down. But then after that, the Industrial Revolution, the population skyrocketed. We are now almost at 8 billion human beings on the planet. Will we get to 10 or 12 or 15 billion human beings on the planet? How much can the planet sustain? Okay, this is the same thing in a little bit more detail. And I don't know that there's an answer to that question at this point in time. We have increased the carrying capacity, or how many humans can be on the planet, with advances in technology and agriculture, etc. How high can we go? Well, it depends kind of a little bit on this model. So if we look at this model, can we live more sustainably, and what do we need to live? So what are the things that Earth provides for us? In Earth's life support system, there are the atmosphere. The Earth provides us with a relatively clean atmosphere, a hydrosphere, the water, bodies of water, the oceans, the Great Lakes, the rivers, the streams, etc. Soils and rocks, the lithosphere, which provide minerals, nutrients, which end up making our soil, and then the biosphere, which is the life forms on the planet. All of those interact with the human culture, with humans. And how do these two interact? Well, it depends upon, on the human side, how many humans there are on the planet, what are their worldviews and ethics relative to the environment and to each other, what kind of politics are involved here, and what kind of economics. So these two are connected by a very strong bridge. If the economics drive the human behavior and the ethics, then that's going to have a greater impact on either the air, the water, or the life forms. If we have a more sustainable worldview, then maybe this air was not going to be such a one-way street where humans are taking all that nature has to give. And then some. Okay, so what are the goals of this course in environmental science in general? To figure out, number one, how nature works. If we understand how it works, then maybe we can figure out how to live with it in a long-term relationship. How the environment affects us. So if we live in Arizona, the environment affects us differently than if we live on the coast of Louisiana and have to live through hurricanes. All right, how do we affect the environment? Well, why are there so many hurricanes in the last 20 years? Look at the mean water temperature in the Gulf of Mexico, and you'll see that we are in fact affecting the environment, which is then impacting us. And then how can we live more sustainably without degrading the life support systems that support us and the rest of the planet? Okay, so there is an integrative theme here that runs throughout the course, and it's sustainability. So sustainability is the ability of the Earth's various systems to survive and adapt, and they're going to do that no matter what. If we even blow up nuclear bombs and eradicate all human life on the planet, somehow various Earth systems will come back. For example, look at Chernobyl. Things have come back to Chernobyl even after that disaster. All right. But for us to get to a sustainable level, what must we do in order to make that happen? So here's kind of how this process works. We have a very diverse, alive biosphere based upon all of those other features, the air, the water, the soil, and the rocks. And then along comes humans, and we take natural capital degradation. Okay? We want paper so we can write, and we want a wood to build our houses, so we cut down the forest. All right, well, then so how do we respond? We come up with a solution. Okay, we can't clear cut because that really destroys not only the forest, but the soils underneath it, which then makes it longer for it to respond and rebound. All the animals that used to live there are now either have to move or they die. So we make a law, no clear cutting. All right, well, then there are some trade-offs because we come back and plant, and maybe it's not as diverse. This system and those systems have a huge different biodiversity index, and therefore this one supports a lot more organisms than this one does, but it's better than this. So there are some trade-offs. And then what this really comes down to is, as individuals, we matter. And what we do, and what we buy, and how we use our monetary capital impacts the natural capital. So if we can figure out how to make environmentally sustainable societies, it's got to be based upon this kind of equation. Natural capital equals natural resources plus natural services. So the basic needs of its people, how can we meet everybody's basic needs without degrading the environment? And if we look at this a little closer, what does that really mean? So if here's natural capital, what goes into making up the Earth's resources, its capital? And those things are natural resources, all of these water, air, soil, land, biodiversity, non-renewable stuff, renewable stuff, okay, and the services. So what service does nature play for us? Well, nature certainly purifies the air. In other words, go walk in the forest and the air is much cleaner than if you walk in the city. Why? Because there are factors, the biodiversity there is in fact filtering and cleaning the air. Water storage, soil renewal, nutrient cycling, all of these factors are services that the environment provides for all organisms. Humans just happen to be anthropomorphic and anthrocentric, and therefore we think they're for us. Okay. terms to clarify. There is economic growth, economic development, and economic population growth. Okay, so economic growth provides people with more goods and services. So the more the economy grows, how do we measure how the economy grows? Well, it's measured in gross domestic product. How much stuff do we produce? So as a society, how many widgets are we making? How many computers? How many laptops versus PCs versus blah, blah, blah. Okay? And how much purchasing power does an individual in that society have? So yeah, I have this much income, and if I have this much income in Georgia, that's a lot different than my income purchasing power parity versus California or New York City, where the cost of living is much greater. That laptop here that cost $1,200 there cost $3,200. So I have much less purchasing power parity with the same income, if that makes sense. Okay? Economic development uses economic growth to improve living standards. So we will look quite a bit at whether a country is developed or developing, and there are a bunch of ways to break that apart, but that's developed versus developing are based upon basically gross domestic product, GDP, and PPP, purchasing power parity. Now let's take a look at the global outlook. Look at the world's percentage of the world's population. 18% of the world this is kind of backwards. The red countries are, in this graph, red represents developed countries, yellow represents developing countries. So 18% of the world's population is in the developed countries. Up here, that would be Europe, America, parts of South America, parts of China, etc. Okay, versus 82% is in developing countries. The population growth is very, very low in the developed countries, much higher in the developing countries. Whereas the wealth and income, so if here's where most of the people are, look where most of the money is. 85%, these are basically flipped for wealth and income. So 85% of the money is in the developed countries, and only 15% is in the developing countries. So if you are a person living someplace in the middle of Africa, you don't have access to money via a bank, or you probably don't have as high of an income, so it's harder for you to make more money, so this deck is already stacked against you. Okay? Resource uses, again, follows the wealth and income. Huge amount of resource use in the developed countries, and much less in the developing countries. And then pollution and waste, yes, still amazingly high, 3 times more pollution and waste for 18% of the population versus 25 for 82% of the population. Okay, so this is that in a little bit more detail. All right, but then now let's look at the increasing level of poverty. Whereas in this case, red is high poverty, and the lighter color is less poverty. So North America, both US and Canada, the level of poverty is pretty low. Mexico, it's a little bit higher, but not as bad as certain parts in South America. But Africa has some serious poverty hotspots, as does parts of the Mideast and parts of Southeast Asia. And China is not as high as Europe, but it's come a long ways. Okay. Next major idea are resources. So if we have developing and developed countries, how do those developing countries get ahead? By using resources. And there are 3 basic types of resources. There are perpetual resources, renewable resources, and non-renewable resources. So perpetual resources are things like sun, rain, tides, gravity, things that you know are going to happen. Well, unless you live in California and rainfall is one of your perpetual resources. It hasn't happened for a while. But in general, if you live in Georgia, rainfall is a perpetual resource. So those are things that happen on a relatively consistent basis. Okay, renewable resources might take a little bit more time, but they will come back. For example, paper and forests and building supplies are pretty much a renewable resource. When I lived in South Africa, in Swaziland, they planted wattle trees because they grew 60 feet in 15 years. They could then, every 15 years, harvest those forests, take those logs and use them to support the gold mines in Johannesburg. So that was a pretty renewable resource. Rubber that's cut from trees is renewable because the next year the tree will make more. There are, think of some others. What other renewable resources are out there that you can think of that we use? Then non-renewable resources, coal, oil, gasoline, natural gas, gold, minerals. We can't make more gold. We've been trying for 1,000 years to make more gold unsuccessfully. We can't take lead and turn it into gold on a significant and inexpensive level. Okay, so renewable or non-renewable resources exist as a fixed quantity. We only have so much gold. We only have so much oil. We only have so much coal and natural gas. We only have so much sand. Although you think of sand as inexhaustible, it's not really. There is more of it being made, but it's very, very slow rate. So glass, which comes from sand, is in fact a non-renewable resource. We should be recycling all of our glass, recycling, reusing it, because there's only a limited amount of sand. It's relatively cheap, so we don't do that nearly as much as we should. Okay. Okay, next idea is how many renewable and non-renewable resources do we as individuals use, or we as a nation use, or we as a world use, and how much can the Earth sustain? So this is what's called the Earth's ecological capacity, or the ecological footprint. So how big of a footprint do each of us make? I have to drive from Aiken to Augusta every day, about 35 to 40 miles. Okay, that's every day. Now, I don't drive an electric car. I should, but I don't. I drive a 6-cylinder thing that gets 26 miles to the gallon. But I should be driving, if I'm going to use a gasoline-powered car, I should be driving something that gets 40 or 50 miles to the gallon. That makes my footprint, how much of the Earth's resources I use every day, increase significantly. Okay? So what's called the Earth's ecological capacity is this green dotted line. And here's the human ecological footprint. How much of the resources are we using? And you'll notice back in the 1980s, early 1990s, we surpassed the Earth's capacity. We are now, 30 years later, we're on borrowed time. How much of the Earth's capacity can we continue to use beyond its ability to sustain without the Earth crashing? So here's the United States, total footprint in, this is in million hectares, and the share of the global. The United States, which doesn't have 25% of the population, uses 25% of the Earth's ecological capacity. Okay? European Union, about 19%, China, about 18%, India, about 7%, Japan, about 5%. And here's the footprint per person. So, and this is in hectares per person, about 9.7 hectares per person. So in other words, it takes 9 hectares, or almost 10 hectares, to support each of us in this room. Versus in the European Union, only about 5. In China, about 1.6, almost 2. India, Japan is a little bit higher. But we're way out there. We're twice what anybody else is. Why? Because we're greedy? I don't know. Okay. Just talked about that, and this. Okay. So, next major idea is pollution. So if we're using these non-renewable resources, that means that what's happening to the waste from using those resources? They come out as pollution. And if they're found at high enough levels in the environment, they're going to cause harm to organisms that are existing in the environment. And there can be 2 major types of pollution, point source and non-point source pollution. In other words, if we can point at a source, oh, it's coming from that factory smokestack, that's a point. If we're saying it's coming off of the roads, pollution from automobile exhaust or oil leakage, we can't say it's that road or that spot on that road. It's someplace along the highway system that's getting into the creek. And it's causing an oil slick on the creek, which is then killing the algae, which is then decreasing the food for fish, etc., etc., all the way up the food chain. Okay, so point and non-point source pollution is a major way, the major types of pollution. Now, they can have three types of unwanted effects. They can disrupt or degrade life support systems, in other words, attack the biota somehow. They can damage health and property. For example, in Love Canal up in Buffalo, New York at Niagara Falls, the seepage of these waste products into the soil made people get cancer. And then they can create nuisance such as noise. For example, who wants to live at the end of JFK's runway where you have 3 planes taking off a minute? That's a lot of noise. It'd be hard to sleep there at night. Okay, or smells, sights, tastes, etc. Or for us here in Augusta, how many days have you gotten to school, gotten out of your car, and the air smells nasty? All right, that's an air pollution coming from a point source, which is just down the road from us. Okay. Okay, environmental problems causing connections. Okay, so what causes the pollution? Number one has got to be population growth. The more humans there are, the more resources we use, the more waste we produce. Simple, straightforward answer. But how we use those resources becomes very, very important. So how we use them, therefore, and how we dispose of those wastes become a very, very important factor. Poverty and poor environmental accounting. So if we dismantle, before there was an EPA, there was no accountability, so companies could do whatever they wanted to do, put it all out into the atmosphere, and nobody cared. Well, people started to care, and then they finally got around to developing the EPA, which then started to make factories accountable for what they were producing. And the other side of that is ecological ignorance. And we'll get into a couple cases of those right here in Augusta, where we had some ecological ignorance, and that was changed, and therefore that changed the pollution levels. Okay, so if we look at the human, economic, and cultural systems, so how does society work, and what are the inputs to that? Well, certainly there's solar capital, there's human capital, and there's natural capital. So if this is America, let's say, all right, and our whole economic system, what goes in? Well, Silicon Valley has a lot of human capital, creating and being productive and inventive, thinking differently outside the box. That's human capital coming up with new ideas. And the human capital of actually making an automobile and turning it from a piece of rock into a car, that's a lot of human capital. The natural capital is the rock that was used to make that car. That turned into steel, which then, etc. Okay? And solar capital, energy, heat. All right, so what is the outproduct of that? Are the goods and services? That's what we want in the United States. That's what we get a lot of. All right, but then there are some other not so positive outflows. The heat that's produced, in order to make that rock turn into steel, you have to heat it up to 3,000 degrees, and that's producing a lot of heat. It's producing some other non-biodegradable resources, and certainly non-renewable resources, and a lot of pollution and waste. If we could get better at recycling and reusing them, we would have less impact. This arrow could be a little bit smaller. So that poses the question, why is there not a bottle bill in Georgia? So that we would recycle all of our plastics and all of our glass. Decrease that natural capital dynamic. Okay, so here's how this kind of natural capital degradation works. So we have population growth. Population in the United States has gone up drastically in the last 100 years. And we all want some resources, and so we get unsustainable resources and we use them. Okay, so after that F-350 is 10 or 12 years old, what happens to it? It goes to the junkyard, and then what happens to it after that? It's still a pile of metal. Where does it go? Okay, poverty is associated in this degradation, and what we don't factor in, the cost of this truck doesn't necessarily include accurately the environmental costs. In other words, how much money does Ford put in to reclaiming all the land that it took to mine the steel, to drill oil wells for the plastic, for the bumpers, etc. Right, we don't necessarily factor that all into the cost of the vehicle. And rather than being an $85,000 vehicle, it really should probably be a $160,000 vehicle, but we don't want to pay that. So we're short-shifting the environment. The other thing that we are tending to do is it's easier for us to manage a monoculture, in other words, just one plant, wheat, versus an entire ecosystem with a big diversity, where we only get a little bit of wheat. We want to optimize our productivity, but we minimize the diversity in the process. And in the long run, that's short-sighted because we could have more productivity if we have greater diversity. But we haven't figured that out yet. Okay. All right. Now, we also have this mentality of cleanup. For example, there's this whole big part of the EPA which goes in and cleans up toxic sites. Well, why don't we have the idea of prevention? Not let those sites happen to begin with. If we could prevent them from happening, it wouldn't cost us billions of dollars to clean it up after it's done. Okay, there are some problems relying with cleanup. It's only a Band-Aid. So we've got down the road here in South Augusta, there's this soil that was all contaminated. Okay, so we go in and we scrape all that soil off so that now people can live there again. But what do we do with this soil? Now we've got it all in trucks, it's contaminated. Where are we going to take it? Wherever we take it is going to be contaminated. Why didn't we stop the contamination before it happened? That would have been a much better solution. Okay? All right, now, how does poverty play into this entire thing? Poverty and environmental problems, 1 in 3 children under 5 suffer from severe malnutrition. Okay? 1 in 6 is very, very severe. All right, and look at the number of people in the world's population. About 37% have lack of access to adequate sanitation. So over a third of the people don't have a toilet to go to the bathroom in. About a third of the people don't have enough fuel for heating and cooking. That's, you know, if you're cooking with buffalo chips or cow pies, that's fuel, and you can get by, but there's some issues with that. Okay, electricity, about 25% of the world's population lacks access to any kind of electricity. Drinking water, about 17%, adequate health care, 17%, and enough food for good health, that's called food security. We'll get to that quite a bit. And that's about 17% of the population doesn't know where their next meal's coming from. 17% of the 8 billion human beings on the planet don't know where their next meal's coming from. And yet, I go home and I've got a freezer full of food and a refrigerator full of food. Something is not right with that picture. Okay? Okay. So, in terms of resource consumption, there are those individuals that underconsume, don't like that boy in the last picture with his rickets and his chest really emaciated. He's not getting enough for adequate growth and development. Whereas some of us have overconsumption and affluenza, to the point of we are way above that ecological footprint and it's unsustainable. How long can that last? Here's kind of a parallel track of how this works. Connections between environmental problems and their causes. So here's a family, let's say in Ghana or someplace, and we have this population, okay? And the consumption per person is the affluence. So how affluent is this particular group of people? And the technological impact per unit of consumption. So if they're consuming mealy meal for dinner tonight, how much environmental impact does that have? And therefore we get the environmental impact of the population. So if we multiply population times the consumption per person times the technology impact per unit of consumption, we get the environmental impact. Take a family like that versus the typical white family in the United States, and you have this population, which is a little bit less. You have the consumption per person, though, the affluence. Compare this house and this vehicle to that house and foot power, and how much waste is generated, and we have a much higher environmental impact per person, or certainly for the population, in an affluent society versus one that is much more closer to sustainability. Not that it's totally sustainable, but it's closer. Okay. Now, a couple of things have happened over the course of human history that have changed its path. The agricultural revolution allowed people to stay in one place, a couple thousand years ago. Then next came the industrial medical revolution, where we began to make much more sophisticated things. And then we are now in the information globalization revolution, which is giving us all rapid access to information. That's the only way that we can have virtual learning in a COVID environment because of this particular revolution. We'll discuss each of those revolutions in more detail as we go through the course. Okay, but a little bit, the industrial medical revolution made mass production of useful, affordable products, and it had higher standard of living, greatly increased the agricultural production, lower infant mortality, longer life expectancy, increased urbanization, lower rate of population growth. But look at some of the disadvantages. Increased air pollution, increased water pollution, increased waste pollution, soil depletion, groundwater depletion, habitat destruction, and biodiversity loss. Okay? So yes, there were these great things, but yes, there were these things that kind of offset it from the natural capital perspective. All right. Now, sustainability and environmental worldviews. There are some people who are technological optimists who said, oh, look, back in the 1940s, the population was getting larger. We thought we were going to run out of food. And then we had the Green Revolution, which increased our productivity of food significantly. So therefore, people didn't starve to death. Well, people still starve to death. But for the affluent countries, there was plenty of food to go around. Okay, so as we approach this 8 to 10 billion human beings on the planet, the technological optimists will say, oh yes, technology will find a way for us to get through. Versus the environmental pessimists, we're all going to die. It's just all going to pot in the handbasket. All right, so we have to be careful. What's the science say? What's the data say? How are we going to make decisions going forward in a rational perspective? Okay, so how would you vote? Take a self-assessment poll for a minute. Is the society you live in on an unsustainable path? Yes, thumbs up. Without readily available green products and services, converting to a sustainable society is unrealistic. Or no, not entirely. I'm doing what I can to sustain sustainability, including recycling and using less energy. I think we're going to be all right in the long run. So take a second, think about it, and vote. Okay. Next, there are four main principles of sustainability, and basically the idea is copy nature. Okay? So those are reliance on solar energy. All of nature on this planet, all of life on this planet is based upon solar energy. Look at how much life there is in Antarctica, where the solar radiation is much less than in Brazil, in the middle of the tropical rainforest, where the solar radiation is much greater. More solar radiation, more life, more biodiversity. Okay? And population control. So how do natural populations control themselves? And nutrient recycling. What human population controls are there? So here are those. Now, Aldo Leopold, who was an outdoorsman, worked for the U.S. Forest Service, wrote a very, very important series of books, which we'll get into a little bit later. But he espoused the philosophy that individuals matter, and that life is not a commodity, but that it is something to be revered and respected and treated as if it were alive, because it is alive. Okay? If we abuse the land, it's because we regard it as a commodity. It can be bought and sold, it can be traded, it can be abused, etc. Okay, so what are the four scientific principles of sustainability? and how can we apply those to our society? So, runs on renewable solar energy. All right, well, let's focus on runs on renewable energy. Okay, mostly rely on solar energy. How come every house in Augusta doesn't have a solar panel on its roof? It makes no sense. We have tons of sun every day. It's hotter than all get out there. All right, why don't we have solar panels on our roof? Why don't we have passive solar water heaters to heat up our water? All you have to do is run the water through copper pipes. It'll get hot. You've got plenty of hot water. Recycle nutrients and wastes. Nutrients and wastes get recycled. Whether we benefit from it or not is our own short-sightedness. Okay? So how can we reduce pollution and recycle and reuse our resources? Out at Finney Swamp, they're taking all the organic waste from the city of Augusta, trying to break it down as much as they can using microbes, and then they ship it out to Finney Swamp, and the typha, the cattails, are reusing that nitrogen and phosphorus from our food. They're recycling our food. Okay? Well, we don't get anything out of the cattails, right? They're just cattails growing. They have to go and cut them down once a year and go burn them. Well, if they burned them in a plant that made electricity, that might help. But there could be some better ways to use the energy coming out of it. What if we grew a certain type of bacteria that we could use to make oil? Or we could use to make food? Okay? There are ways we can do this better. Use biodiversity to maintain itself. Okay? We are not very good at preserving biodiversity. It's too complicated. We can't think that hard. Too many animals and plants messing with the fact that I want to grow corn right here. If I grow corn here and I fertilize the heck out of it, I can get a lot of corn and make money. If I have, but that's only one plant in an area that used to have 70 plants. That decreases our biodiversity. We are not protecting nearly enough and utilizing those services. Can we figure out how to farm in a more biodiverse fashion? And finally, control the species population size by resource use by interactions with its environment and other species. Okay? How do we reduce human births and wasteful resources? What? Give everybody the pill? Give everybody a shot every every female a shot every 3 months? That's not really a sustainable way to do that. Yes, we can make all of the shots, but is there another way? I mean, we've eliminated all the predators, so humans don't die to bears and mountain lions and tigers and lions and all that other stuff nearly as much because they're gone, because we're afraid of them, wolves, because we're afraid of them. And that's not really the best way to do that, although that happens in nature. Are there some other ways we could achieve this? I'm just asking. Okay, so here's the current emphasis and pollution cleanup. Well, so pollution cleanup really needs to be pollution prevention. We have to design our industries and our factories so that they don't produce the pollution to begin with, which means we need to make products that are much more sustainable than we're currently using. Okay, we have to, currently we get rid of our waste by burying it or burning it. All right, we need to prevent producing so much waste, and we need to figure out how to reduce that amount of waste and how to reuse it somehow. In other words, a plastic container needs to be used lots and lots and lots of times before it goes back to be recycled and turned into a fleece. Protecting species, we need to protect them where they live. We come in and fix a species after it's gasping for its last breath and there are only 13 of them left. We come and say, oh, we can fix this. And sometimes we do. California condor, we've kind of brought them back from a very, very small number. But why should it get to that point to begin with? Why can't we protect the species where they live? Why are we as a species so intent on killing other organisms? Okay, environmental degradation versus environmental restoration. Increased resource use, well, let's use less wasteful, more efficient resource use. In other words, when you go into buy something, they give it to you in a single-use container. What good is that? You use it, you throw it away, it's waste. Why don't we do things that are much more reusable. Population growth, we need to stabilize the human population growth and decrease the birth rates. And then depleting and degrading natural capital, we need to protect that natural capital even more. Okay, so where as a society do we go? And as a species, where do we go from here? Now, so think about Augusta, think about the United States, then think about all the human beings on the entire planet. So where are we going from here, and what steps do we need to take immediately to help us become a more sustainable society? All right, and so here are your tasks. Number one, go watch the video at the very start in the first frame or two of the lecture. Review the lecture, take your notes as you go through it. Be concise but brief. And then calculate your environmental footprint. There are, up on Canvas, there are some websites that will help you do that, calculate that, and record it. And then there are some other units, some questions that are up there with this unit up on Canvas for you to complete as part of this exercise. That's the end of this particular lecture. Welcome to environmental science.